My name is Kathleen Marie DuHaime, married name. I was born Kathleen Marie Henderson, August 10, 1922, the Roaring Twenties. I'm 98. I turned 98 in August, so I guess I'm 98 and a half. And I was born in Schenectady because my dad was with General Electric, and we happened to be up there at the time. My dad was transferred to Paris office of the General Electric, and I had 2 years in Paris. Unfortunately, I don't remember hardly any of it because it was from 2 and 3, and then we went back to the States again. And then we lived in Passaic, New Jersey, because my mother's parents, my family were there. My father had an interesting story. His grandfather, Mr. Lawrence Henderson, was born on the Shetland Islands, the Isle of Yell. I always love to hear about the Isle of Yell. And it was once owned by Norway. And the village he was born in was Kullervo. And the word vo is Norwegian, meaning inlet. And this group of islands called the Shetlands on the east coast of Scotland. It's nearer Norway, actually. And but that was his father. But then they moved to Edinburgh, the mainland, Edinburgh, in Scotland. And my grandfather, ambitious, hardworking, like many of the Scottish, he got a good job in a grocery business, catering to the carriage trade. And they eventually got a very nice house on Morningside Drive in Edinburgh. And he met Thomasina, his wife-to-be, and proposed, got accepted, and they went on to have 13 children. And my father was the middle one. They lived in this house. It's still standing. And when I went back for a visit, of course, all the Hendersons had gone, but there was a Dr. McKechnie living there. And he invited us in, and it was fun to walk around the house and see. I can't imagine 13 children in it. Oh, one little girl died in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Adelaide. And then one shortly after the family arrived in the United States. A dear little boy called Havelock. And that was very sad. But it was common in those days with a large family of children. But they eventually moved up to Pittsburgh because Grandfather Henderson had decided that Pittsburgh was a good place to be. He had decided that the dry cleaning business was be a good place in a city like Pittsburgh, which at the time was the center of the coal industry. And they had many wealthy homes. And he set up not only for customers, but for businesses, commercial dry cleaning. And a lot of the sons went into that. But they bought a house, they settled on Roop Avenue in Pittsburgh, and they lived there for many years. Dad was one of the independent, a bit of a maverick in the family, and he wasn't going to go into business with his dad, like some of his brothers. One was an inventor, one was they did various things. But Daddy, had a asthma problem, and the doctor recommended he go down to a warm climate. And he'd always been fascinated by the idea of Texas. I guess growing up, it had a romance. And he went down there and volunteered or was taken on as a cowboy. And there was a ranch, I'm not sure of the town, but the name of the owner of the ranch was Old Man Rockman. Daddy used to tell stories about Old Man Rockman on the ranch and a bunch of other cowboys, much older than he. He was only 20, maybe not 20 by then. So we settled into a cowboy's life for about 2 or 3 years, which didn't please the father up in Pittsburgh, because he sent letters all the time. Robert, you have to find a good living, something, that you'll be a good provider for the family when you marry. And so Dad ignored him in the beginning. But he went on to, he drifted into another part of Texas and made friends with a very nice chap his age who was training to go into the vaudeville. Vaudeville was very big then. And he shared, they were in a boarding house, they shared a room. And he taught Daddy all the tricks of the trade, tap dancing, different kinds of dances, songs, jokes. And when this reached the ears of Henderson Sr., there was another rapid letter was written. Dear Robert, I suggest you get into something more steady. In those days, anyone on the stage was kind of not morally sound. And so Dad listened to him, got into General Electric, clerical work. Because he was a great personality and a quick learner, he worked his way up, and that's where he met my mother. She was in the typing pool. The Garrity family, that was my mother's name before she became a Henderson, delightful Irish family. Her mother and father, I think it was her grandparents had come over from Ireland, Irish on both sides. And they settled in. They went to New England first, Massachusetts. And then they moved shortly afterwards because Grandpa had to look around for a good living. Grandpa Thomas Garrity, a wonderful man, easygoing, very easygoing, not strict. Grandma Garrity did the big decisions in life. It works out that way. She was in charge of the money, a very practical woman, very sweet. And they moved down to Passaic, New Jersey. Mother was, I don't know, not sure of her age, but she went to school down there, and she had 3 sisters. 2 boys were stillborn, so they lost those brothers early. But 4 girls, they had 4 girls. Mama was the eldest. And she was they were all very good students. In fact, the 2 younger sisters were valedictorians in their class at school. And Mother went on to Drake Business College. I remember her talking about it. And she became very efficient at the shorthand typing, spelling, and math, unlike her daughters. And of course, she was called upon one day for Mr. Henderson wanted a typist, and she turned up looking, had that Irish coloring, dark, rosy cheeks and very black hair, and immaculately it turned out. She was very fastidious about her white collars and her shoelaces. She used to wash her shoelaces at night. That kind of fastidious. And of course, caught Daddy's eye. He was about at least 12 years older than her. She was about 24 then, 23. And one thing led to another, and she invited him out to Passaic to meet her family. Now, he was brought up strict Scottish Presbyterian, and in those days, Catholics were, should we trust them or not? All kinds of misconceptions about the Irish. And she brought him out to Passaic, and the family fell in love with him. He was charming. He loved them at first sight. You couldn't resist the Garritys. And they were kept low profiles, the Hendersons were more concentrated on gaining, material things. The Garritys were very good practicing Catholics, and comfort and being kind to people was more important to them. They had a very cozy house, hospitality, and they took to Robert Henderson. They thought their daughter Edith had found a good man, and when Daddy came more frequently, he'd stay at the Y, They didn't put him up in the house. That wasn't quite seemly. But he stayed at the Y. And pretty soon, then his parents heard, Grandpa Garrity, he was seeing a Catholic. He was going to marry her, for heaven's sake. He went for instruction just to know more about mother was a practicing Catholic, and any children were going to be brought up Catholics. That was understood. But anyway, he didn't become a Catholic then and there, but he understood the religion more. And then we lived in Passaic. I think he was still working for the General Electric. By then he had risen up, and he got a reputation for being a good salesman as well. And, just at that point in time, the electric light was being celebrated, was discovered. It was the thing to do to have electricity in your home when most people still had gas lighting. Can you believe it was that long ago? And he had a good position in the office. In fact, so well, they'd had that 2 years in Paris with an apartment in the Square de Trocadero, and there was a park there. And Mother took to that very easily for a girl who was brought up, simply Irish background. She was very easily adjusted to that. We had a maid or a nanny who took us for a walk in the park. And I remember something they told me. I was so set in my schedule that if she took the wrong way into the park, I'd start screaming. I wanted the same way into the park. And I thought, what a brat. I remember going to kindergarten in America, and my sister running home, she would wait for me, and she'd run home and always tell Mother the picture I'd drawn. I love drawing, and I drew a cow, and I had to rush home and tell Mother, I drew a cow today, here it is. And Patsy knew this, and she was jealous of me, and she would race home, get home. She was 6 years older. She'd rush in the door, Mommy, Kathleen drew a cow today. And I was so frustrated, I would stamp my feet. And it happened, I fell for it. She'd ask me first, what did you draw? And she would race on ahead. Oh, my Lord. But she turned into a great sister when she got older. My brother had been born in the States, a big arrival, younger brother, 5 years younger. And that was Lawrence. And Patsy was the older sister, of course. And the next assignment, after I was then 5, he was transferred to the London office. And Dad himself had never been to England. His life had been in Scotland up to 19. He'd gone to a very good school in Edinburgh, George Watson, it's known. And he got a very good education, turned into a great reader, loved history. And anyway, with the family packed up, the company packed you up in those days, all your family and your possessions and furniture and the car. I mean, that's what they did in those days. It was 1928. But England made a big impact on me when I was only not quite 6. Well, first of all, the ocean crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It took almost 5 days. And it was great, this huge boat, getting on the boat at night. The most dramatic thing. You're standing by the boat, and it's up there, and you're going to be on this thing for over 4 or 5 days. And it was so exciting walking up the gangplank and the room. Pat and I had, I don't remember. Mom and Dad had a first-class stateroom, and we had a room, and the excitement, we playing a ball on the deck. And that left a vivid impression because the ball fell into the Atlantic Ocean. And that was a favorite ball. It was white with dots on it like Braille. Red, white, and blue stripes. And one day we're playing, and it goes into the Atlantic Ocean. And that feeling of take a ball and take the Atlantic Ocean, and a feeling of great loss. It made a dramatic impact on my mind and how sad I felt. But I got over that. When we arrived, we stayed in a series of hotels because it was a London hotel, and I like to talk about the Hans Crescent Hotel near Harrods, and it was beautiful. I missed a year of school. They, first of all, had to find a house they wanted to settle in, and they spent quite a lot of time with Patsy and me sitting in the back seat of the car, going out, exploring different towns. And then they decided it was going to take a long time. They rented a house in Wimbledon, tennis, but we weren't aware of that. And this house was a lovely old house, and it had the most beautiful garden. I got to know what an English garden is like. They don't have yards. They have delightful gardens. Even if it's a tiny plot of land, it's the Englishman's home is his castle. We could afford a gardener, we could afford a maid, a nurse for my brother, and a cook and a butler, well, not, I would say butler, but a man for the heavy work. And he would sometimes serve at the table when we had company. It was pretty fancy living because they did a lot of entertaining, business friends. Daddy made friends with people all around Europe. We had Japanese, Germans, and a lot of Jewish people he became great friends with that were getting out of Germany at that time. So we had them over, the Meinhardts and their family. So the complications of arriving in a new country for my mother, there again, she took like a duck to water, English life. Father was used to British ways, etc. He'd never been to England, but he settled down in the General Electric Company, became very popular, and proceeded to visit Western Europe, every country in Western Europe, over a period of time, because that was the territory. We lived in the same house 20 years. It was already then about 50 years old, and three stories, and a nursery right at the top of the house. The nursery was used as our playroom. I had all our books and toys there. Patsy was getting a bit old, but I was put in the same category as my brother. So we spent many a day in the room upstairs, the nursery, and the nurse, they called them nurses, governess, if you will, she would keep an eye on us and bring tea up at the afternoon. She had to climb up 2 pairs of stairs, and we had tea in the nursery. We played a lot of games. My brother and I grew quite close because I could make up games. I was older, and he did pretty much what I wanted him to. Every house in England has a name, even the tiniest house. And Dad, for old time's sake, when he grew up, first of all in Edinburgh, it was near Edinburgh Castle, and it was Rosslyn Castle, and he loved that name, so he called our house Rosslyn, and it had a gate like most houses, and a fence all around it, and it was an acre and a half, had a little summer house in the back, and my bedroom was above at the back, and I could look out of the window at the lawn. And one of my precious memories, well, first of all, I always liked to get the moonlight on my pillow, and I guess I was lucky because I always could get my pillow on the moon, and I'd go to sleep with the moon on my face. I don't know why that was. Maybe it accounts for a lot. But anyway, another thing was the cuckoo, sound of the cuckoo bird. Let's say in April morning, it's kind of damp and misty, and you hear the early voice of the cuckoo coming across the green lawn, very faint, cuckoo, cuckoo, with a big pause in between each cuckoo. That's very much part of my memory. Local school, there was a convent and a French order of nuns known as the Order of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. And they had been in the convent had opened in the last 2 or 3 years. It was fairly new. We could walk to school if we had the time. Took over a half an hour. I settled in the first day. There weren't many pupils then. There's only about, 50 girls altogether. They took little boys in the kindergarten. And then after that, no boys. Never seen nor heard. There were many sisters from different countries. I know there was Belgian, Spanish. Most of them, there were some 3 lay sisters were British. The games teacher was very British. Her name was Stubbs, I think. She was very much, come on girls, out for hockey now, play the game kind of thing. And we had Madame Patrick. I could give a little sketch of each one. She was very intellectual. She'd come from a very grand family. And she was a large woman. She had green eyes and a very aristocratic nose. And they all wore these lovely, habits, with a starched bonnet round their faces. And it must have been a bit uncomfortable because her cheeks were pushed in a bit. But Madame Patrick would sail in, or she would glide in like a ship in full sail. And they always blessed the hour. Before the hour each period was an hour, and she would come in, starting with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father and the Son, she would quell any noise as soon as she started praying and bless the hour, and we'd say a suitable prayer. And then she'd settle her garments around her before she sat down. And then she taught English and literature and poetry, and I loved that. So I was my sister before me was one of her favorite pupils, and my friend Philippa Turnbull was another. She had a few favorites because we had the ability to express ourselves in the imagination, If someone got up and didn't know what they were talking about, she had a way of waving her hand and saying, sit down, when you were squashed. We didn't live very far from the convent, but a little too far if you were late in the morning. And we found there was a bus we could take into Epsom town. Epsom is the name of the town we lived in, incidentally. But the 164 bus, red bus, double-decker, stopped outside our house. We would get it down the hill. They'd stop at Epsom town, then they would turn around. So we got out there, and we had a good 15-minute walk to the school from there. And you had to be on time. And then as years passed by, they built a very big school hall where we'd assemble. We had more pupils then. And it was all very stiff. You always had to be thinking of your posture. I wish I'd listened more. And I soon made friends. They thought, there was no TV then, you have to remember. And the idea of seeing people come from the United States, they had seen Hollywood movies about cowboys and Indians, no television. The movies had been about gangsters. So you imagine the average knowledge of not just children, but even adults was very faint about what Americans were like, as were those in America regarding the British. They all thought the British walked around in tuxedos and talked like that and said, old chap, But the nuns soon made themselves, they were the favorite ones and the ones that were awful. And then the dear sisters that did all the work and cleaning. And one sight I'll never forget, the sisters were generally French. There was one Belgian one. And they would do all the house cleaning. And in those days, what they did, they attached huge polishing cloths to their feet, like they were going to skate or something. And the polish was on the floor, and they'd skate around the floors getting a wonderful shine. That's how they clean the floors. If you ever see any old French movies, you may see that. Fascinating. And we had Sister Cook, who was a generous soul, thank goodness. And the kitchen, we ate in a very serious room called the refectory, and it had long tables and benches, no talking allowed during meals, except when you were boarders, you could talk during dinner. And if it was someone's birthday, you were allowed to talk, or a saint's day. And otherwise, it was learning how to handle your knife and fork and getting your food into your mouth and keeping your mouth closed. You know, these very important things. And the headmistress was my nemesis. She was from North Ireland, very strict. Madame Ethel Mary, she had rosy cheeks that were pushed together with her bonnet like this. She had sharp blue eyes. When she got mad about, we don't use that word in England, really annoyed or furious, sparks would fly out. I swear sparks would come out of her blue eyes. And when she was annoyed, we all knew it. She had something to tell the girls. Madame Ethel Mary would walk into the classroom. She always went like this for dramatic effect, as if she had a terrible headache. Girls, she would sit down at the desk. I have to do this little sketch. She'd say, and she'd pause. And she said, "It's reached my ears that one of you girls," and she'd have to stop. Yesterday, in the town, one of you girls was seen. She'd look around and we'd all get red in the face and uncomfortable because we all had guilty consciences about something. One of you girls was seen running down the street without her hat. And we'd all, give us, oh, it's only the hat. So she had a way of instilling fear in you. And then if you had done something really serious, there was always the Reverend Mother. She was a threat. "I'll have to send you to the Reverend Mother." Now that was very seldom materialized. And she was like the Wizard of Oz in a way that she spent most of the day out of sight, but she lived in a mysterious room of her own that had her private toilet and bath, of course, and everything. And I remember being sent to the Reverend Mother because I never did my homework. I mean, there's always an excuse. And Madame Ethel Mary actually said, "I'm going to send you to Reverend Mother." Reverend Mother turned out, she's a French woman from Normandy, very brought up on a farm somewhere, an easygoing person who would prefer not to scold anybody, but she put on her fierce face and she'd clear her throat and she'd say, Kathleen. The French can't pronounce the sound TH. So it was, "Kathleen, what is this I hear?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorry." She said, "How come you don't do your homework?" And there was no reason really. "I'm sorry, I forgot it was too much, blah, blah, blah." And she said, "Well, you have, cough. You have to make much more of an effort, Kathleen." And then I was dismissed. And then to tell you about Reverend Mother, who was a wolf in sheep's clothing. No, the opposite way around. How does that work? She was a wolf. No, she was a sheep in wolf's clothing. Anyway, she had this custom on a special saint's day or feast day in the church. She would come out, or maybe it was, I don't know what day it was. She had a balcony outside her private room, and she'd have one of the sisters accompany her holding a huge can of toffees. That's where they kept toffees, in a huge can, Macintosh toffees. And the sister would also, Reverend Mother, be holding a tennis racket. And you might well ask, what is she doing with a can of toffees and a tennis racket? But it was there for a reason. because she was going to give us a treat. Not the whole school, but it couldn't have been the whole school, but it was always a big body of girls were standing on the lawn by the tulip tree, and they had a tennis court. And Reverend Mother would proceed to toss the toffees down to the girls waiting via the racket. She had the sister put the toffees on the racket, and she'd give a good over the balcony onto the lawn. You're allowed to laugh. And we would scramble for every last toffee. And we didn't find it degrading. And then she'd send another handful of toffees down. And we picked up as many toffees as we could. It was great fun. I learned a lot from the convent, but mostly because of Madame Patrick, the literature and the poetry and the imagination. I also took elocution lessons, and that was very important. Maybe we had slight American accents. I don't think so. But anyway, the elocution teacher was terribly serious about everything, and you had to stand a certain way, put your shoulders back, and have one hand free to gesticulate with dramatic parts of the poem pointing upwards to heaven or down there. And she took a life out of a poem, for goodness sake. But we learned how to project our voices and speak clearly, and that was important. And I actually went into London, to the Poetry Society of London, to enter a competition, girls my age, and a lot of them was some older, and they wore these medals they'd won previously on a velvet bib. And I was a newcomer, and I went up with the teacher, and I had to recite this poem. I have to mention this. It was Robert Browning's poem, Oh, to be Home Thoughts from Abroad. He and his wife, he'd married this wonderful lady poet in London. He was a famous poet. They'd gone to Italy for her health. She was a semi-invalid, and they were living in Italy, and he missed England. And he wrote this poem, Home Thoughts from Abroad. And I won't recite the whole thing, I know it all in my head. But it starts off, Oh, to be in England, now that April's there, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest bough and the brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf, and the chaffinch sings on the orchard bough in England now. That's just the first verse. But anyway, that was funny. And the other, I told you about Sister Cook. She was so generous. She'd always pass extra plates of bread and butter when school was over and we'd played hockey and had big appetites. She'd always pass more bread and butter, and if it was someone's birthday, we'd have jam. So we were always anxious to have someone's birthday. It made it much more exciting. As I grew older, I really didn't enjoy the convent. They were too strict, and the headmistress didn't like me. She'd always admired my sister, Patsy. She was held up as an example. But Kathleen, and I was told she liked to have these tete-a-tetes with us. Kathleen, you're a little bit underhanded and what was it? Deceitful and underhanded. And I wasn't good to tell a child at that age that. And I became very self-conscious. She didn't like me, period. So when my parents, it became worse because they put us in boarding school for a while, and we were left for almost a year, mother and father, and my younger brother, because he was just about a few months, not old enough to leave alone. And they had a business pleasure trip around the world, and they were gone. It seemed like years. They were gone really under a year, but it was very traumatic for both of us. I felt very isolated. Boarding school, morning, noon, and night. And then when the holidays came, the Easter holidays, the Christmas holidays, we went to stay with a residential hotel run by friends my parents both knew well. And they ran this hotel for older people. It wasn't like today's center for adults. They were all old with the hearing trumpets and everything. And they took pity on us because we were the two youngest people in the hotel. And they didn't take us out for the afternoon, see a movie and have a huge tea somewhere with lots of cakes, you know. And there was a dear man, I have to mention Mr. Poulter. He had a stutter like many English people do in England. And he was straight out of Dickens. He had pink cheeks, white hair, a pointed nose, and he stuttered. And he was a lawyer. And he took pity on it. He had a lot of the little boy in himself. He was a bachelor. And he would tell us walks to take. And he'd give us little gifts. And his room was upstairs, and he'd tap messages to us. And he was always giving us a cheerful word. And I say, I could tell you a wonderful place to walk this afternoon. And he was a dear man, God rest his soul. And he made life more bearable. And they eventually came back. Well, one of the most thrilling events in my young life, I was 14, and my mother and father thought it'd be a lovely idea if we could take the kids, my sister and I, back to the States to meet their long-lost relatives. I hadn't seen my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, cousins. There's a whole stack of them. So we got ready for that trip. And I had a permanent wave because my hair was dead straight then. I looked pretty frightful. And my mother looked at me, she said, we'll give you a permanent wave. Yes, definitely. I'm not, Louis was the beauty place downtown. And I looked 100% different. I really felt kind of, here's me, the real me. And I got some new clothes, and we set sail on the SS Manhattan, big ocean liner. It wasn't a cruise ship at all. They were not mentioned in those days. And I think we were up to 4 days to cross the Atlantic, and that was thrilling. Leave at night, it was lovely. We took 4 days, arrived New York City, and meanwhile I had got into Hollywood in a big way. My sister and I, thanks to my sister, she was a great fan, and we'd see all these movies, mostly suitable, I think, in the afternoon. We'd come back and we'd imitate the people we'd seen on the screen. And Patsy was very good at doing Jean Harlow or anyone that shimmied in front of her wardrobe mirror. And I would follow suit. And then we got in the habit of, we had a huge mirror in our house in Epsom, and we'd put on any appropriate music and dance in front of the mirror, you know, to make the moves and see how we looked. And we'd even made up a few steps. And that was fun. And, but the impact of seeing the America, I'd been reading Look magazine and Life magazine regularly, it was out then. And I fed on American commercials. We didn't get American radio or TV, of course. And when I arrived in the States, it was like a dream. I had had fairy tales then. Up till then, I was into fairy tales because that's what English kids do. Up to the age, well, I left the fairy tales behind at 9 years old, and I went into Hollywood. And by the time I was 14, it was quite an adventure for me. And I'll never forget our first impression, the drugstores, the way they smelled. That smell of everything. They weren't just drugs. You could buy anything in a drugstore. And they had ice cream sodas. And they were the marvelous invention. I loved ice cream sodas. And there was so many. We were taken during our stay. We stayed there until after Thanksgiving. We were invited to a friend's house. We went up to Cleveland. We went up to visit relatives in Pittsburgh. We saw American life. We met kids our age going to school. We actually attended one day an American high school in Shaker Heights in Cleveland because our host and hostess had 2 kids. One was my age, one was Patsy's age. And a day at an American school, boys and girls, was quite an education. From the convent, you know, I'd never been near a boy. I mean, my brother's friends were a bit young for me. And they had a school radio. They came to school, some of them in cars. And this was eye-opener to us great kids. You know, you were kept back at the convent, very conservative. You know, the skirts you wore had to touch, when you knelt on the floor, they had to touch the floor. They were never above. If you had a belt round your gym tunic, it couldn't be too tight. You didn't reveal what you had underneath anything. Most unbecoming clothes. Anyway, we left. We met lots of cousins and grandparents. It was wonderful. And particularly grandparents were very kind to us. We loved it. We got back in England, I got back in school, and I didn't like it one little bit after that breath of fresh air. Patsy had gone off to Paris and was studying French at the City University, living with a French family. They took me out of school, and by then I was 15, believe it or not. And they thought, what should we do with Kathleen? One of Daddy's business friends suggested this very nice school in Switzerland, French Switzerland, between Geneva and Lausanne. More rumors were circulating, but they packed me off to Switzerland. The place was called L'Ecom, boarding school for girls, and it was in a village in Switzerland called Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, and it was pretty well known. It was near the Alps. There were girls of all nationalities, which made it so interesting. I mean, from Yugoslavs to Norwegians to Dutch, lots of Germans, lots of Italians, lots of English. And since the political climate was very unsure in Europe then, when we left, we didn't expect it. This was January 1939, and this place was run by a Monsieur Dedy and his wife, who had originally been the main person, but she was an invalid, and Monsieur Dedy had these Swiss blue eyes that looked like they're gazing at distant mountains, you know, those dreamy blue eyes. And he was left with the care and running. His wife helped a bit, but he was in charge of the care and feeding and supervision of these 30 girls at least, more, 40. And with all these crises happening in Europe, every time, and you see, we went back to our little groups. We were mixing more or less with the other girls. We had to speak French all the time, and of course, none of our French was perfect. But we had a tendency, when the English girls spoke French, we could understand that French, but not the Italians or the other. So human nature is to get into little groups. And I shared a room, a German girl, she was very nice, Hertha Gross, and she had 5 brothers in the German army, and there are pictures of them on the wall. And when she had friends over, it was a room for 2, her German friends would be there, and they'd always stop talking when I walked in. And I felt rather self-conscious. And then the English would be in a huddle talking about England going to war with Germany. And the Italians would get hysterical, you know, oh, whatever you say in Italian, oh. And everybody would go in their little corners, and Monsieur Dedy was slowly going mad, trying to handle these hysterical girls. Well, I'm exaggerating, but it was like that. And the months went by, and it was time, July, we were all going home for the summer break. July was going to be several weeks off from school, and one of my best friends there, Paula Potter, had decided we'd take the room with the balcony. We had that choice. It was much nicer than the other rooms. And we didn't pack up our clothes, just enough what we needed in England. And I remember the trip back to England, my sister met me at the railroad station in Paddington. And at first, being a sister, she said, "Oh my God, you got so fat." Because we had chocolate all the time, eating this rich. And when any of us went to a little village, Roll, this village had 3 or 4 bakeries. I can remember the names. We always went into each little bakery. There was always plates and forks. And it was understood that you would have 2 or 3 more of these pastries or chocolate eclairs or donuts. And you can imagine, and the chocolate we ate. And then we'd make a big fuss when they weighed us. Oh, mon Dieu, oh, the kilos, oh. And we'd get hysterical how much weight we were putting on. Up to this point, war seemed imminent, but nobody would really believe it. But the country had been preparing in numerous ways. They had air raid wardens established for each neighborhood. People were making blackout curtains. Ration books were being issued, I think, ahead of time. It looked pretty bad all around. And we were, the ARP, anti-air raid precautions, we were learning, groups of people in different neighborhoods were learning how to put out an incendiary bomb if it landed. We were thinking of parachutes, Germans landing on golf courses and open spaces and Epsom Downs, vast amount of open land. And people, the Home Guard was formed. And, Churchill saying, we shall fight in the roads, in the alleys, in the lanes. His accent, you hear his voice now. At that point, we were home on Sunday, yes. And we didn't hear the sirens. We heard the announcement on the BBC program. In those days, the announcers spoke in very important voices. This is a national program. We have to announce that this morning at so-and-so time, war was declared by the British, when they said British Isles or whatnot, on Germany. Now exists a state of war. But my brother and I, we had been instructed in the event of an air raid, which we had reason to suspect, you had to remove all objects, pictures you had around, mirrors, any heavy objects that were on the phone that in the home that might be dangerous. So I took these words very seriously. I told my brother to get the big laundry basket, and we proceeded to strip all the ornaments from the living room and lounge in the downstairs quarters, and wrap them and pack them in this laundry basket. Now, my parents arrived back from church. My mother's reaction, you what? She was the last person to turn her house upside down just to oblige some silly air raid precautions. I mean, it wasn't funny, but she was outraged. From then on, life changed a lot. Except the first year of the war, nothing much happened. It started to be called the phony war. And that was dangerous, of course, but people were on the tiptoe, ready. There was a big public hall that was used for a municipal swimming pool indoors and staging big events. And that was turned into a place where the ambulance was stored, all the other nurses, doctors, everything, the emergency center, this huge hall was turned into that. And so everything happened. And Patsy got a job, of all things. People were doing an awful lot of sitting around. She volunteered to give exercises on the stage so people would sit and get fatter and keep their muscles in tone. And she did a splendid job. I thought of joining up, because at 18, now I was 18, going on 19. In England, when you're not doing your bit, particularly in case of wartime, in the past wars, you would get, if you didn't do something active, you'd get a white feather. It was a sign of cowardice. Patsy got a white feather in the mail. I mean, that's not a thing a lot of people don't know. Because she was 6 years older, she was busy going down to the bars and conducting exercises, etc., etc. And so she was very upset about that. As war continued and Hitler was getting more desperate, it didn't look good. The worst was yet to come. But he started sending these buzz bombs over. First bad bombings that occurred, the Blitz, the London Blitz, they had to travel over our area, Surrey, in England. And before I joined the Wrens, we'd have, this is very important, to be in England then and hear the air raid siren. The warning one, and people would get out of their beds, or they had their shelters downstairs or in the garden. We didn't have a shelter, we had a downstairs room, which in the beginning we'd get up at some ungodly hour and sit in this room with walls, very strong walls around it. And my mother we'd hear the German bombers flying overhead. That zoom, maybe 80 bombers in the sky flying over us. Now they weren't out to bomb us, but they were on their way to London, and they did a pretty good job. But they never, I could mention the spirit of the London population, the Cockneys who went down to the underground every night. They had the bedding there, the mattresses, the facilities for making tea and having a sing-song, and they kept the spirit going. It was like a flame. They did have a wonderful, cheerful attitude. It's amazing. No one sat there saying, this is awful, or worrying. And that's what got us through that war, the Blitz part of it. But back to the buzz bombs. They were sent over indiscriminately. They crossed the channel, and they gave no warning. There was a faint buzz, but it's when they stopped buzzing, they knew they were going to. We knew they were going to drop. They were controlled back in the continent, in France, and they would come whizzing down, and of course they would get a lot of people. My father's office was in the Strand, in Crown House, the General Electric, and he would come out for lunch, and he'd see bodies in the street, terribly mutilated, missing. Oh, it was awful. But you know, people just steeled themselves and carried on. You had to keep the stiff upper lip. Just before America came into the war in 1942, I decided, because word was getting around that everybody had to do something or you would be called up and told what to do, and I did not want to join the Women's Land Army. That was a really serious outdoor working, replacing the guys that were called from the farms. You ended up wearing these corduroy breeches and this sweaters galore, going around on motorbikes and digging up turnips and potatoes in a frozen field. I thought, well, I had a choice, really, joining the Women's Royal Naval Service, the ATS, which was the women's branch of the Army, and the Air Force, the WAFs, but the WREN stood for the Women's Royal Naval Service. And it happened to have a nice uniform. It was a navy blue suit, white collar, black tie, and a very cute little hat. I mean, this might sound very frivolous, but it was important. I had to go up to London to enlist, and I remember it was Queen Anne's Gardens, near Big Ben, Westminster Abbey. And I was interviewed, and they found out I had 2 nationalities. That set things back a bit, because being born in the States, I'd had American citizenship, and my father was still a British subject, and my mother had become one. And I was sent post haste to the American Embassy in London to renounce my American citizenship, make it formal. And I told him why I was there, and he said in serious tones, "Young lady, do you realize what you were about to do? Commit. You're renouncing your American citizenship." Bum, bum, bum. So I wasn't 19. I said, yes, I know, no big deal. I didn't ever visualize myself going back to America to live. And I renounced it, went back, told I'd be called up within a month. I still wasn't 20, and went back, and sure enough, I was notified, went to the assigned place. The training school was in Hampstead, north of London. It was a former seminary. We were taught things about the Navy and the ranks and the officers and how to salute. We taught how to drill. We drilled every day. Then we passed a test. And I got measured for my officer's uniform, and I felt quite excited. And I was sent down to Southend. Southend is an estuary that goes out, the Thames River goes into the Channel. It was a very nearer Germany, nearer everything. Had a spot that had been bombed a lot, but things were cooling down, but it was still happening. And we were stationed in these little villas facing the ocean, the Channel, which incidentally, all the English coast had been covered with barbed wire. You could go to any spot in the seaside, or at least in the east, south, and lower west, southwest, that hadn't got barbed wire all over the sand. You couldn't come from the sea to the sand. You know, anyone had any idea of landing, it would have been difficult. But Southend was normally a seaside town, very popular, but no one was going there anymore. But we had lots of Wrens down there, officers. We were on night duty in case any reports, mostly to do with the weather. And I remember going to the officers' room and sleeping. They had shifts, and if they were lucky enough to be sleeping at that time, we'd have to go into the room and wake them up and give them the latest info that was coming in about that. And we worked in shifts, and then the following morning, I'd always took the first shift, so I'd get the early sleep. Using the same bed, one Wren would get up and you'd fall into the sheets. It was called Combined Operations Headquarters, and they had been planning the big invasion for some time there. Operation Overlord. That was the invasion. And all the armed forces were combined. The officers they'd taken this old mansion and converted it into different offices, and it was full of officers from every service in that background, with some background in that, of landings, invading, etc. Plus all the Allied forces were in London then, and particularly the Americans. We had people from Poland, people from Free France. There were many nationalities walking around. Americans were over. But my department in the Navy was in charge of the landing craft, which played a big part in the invasion because we had the English Channel to think about. And there was landing craft of all kinds. There was one LCV vehicles, then the LCVs with supplies, then heavier stuff, then that kind of thing. You can imagine the supplies that had to come over with the troops. And they didn't have, computers hadn't fully developed yet. I had been sent to a place for computer training, but unfortunately, knowing me, they didn't waste their time. But computers then stood about 6 feet tall, and you had to stand at them all day. It was quite a demanding job, but I ended up better, I guess. At this point, I was appointed to the most secret registry, and I got to walk around from office to office with these files that were secrets. Wasn't top secret. It was, I think, most secret. And I'd go in, there these officers were talking about planning the invasion, big maps, etc. I had to see the right files got to the right department, and then to have to find a file for me that someone else wanted. All done with a filing system, you know. And this required me to walk all over the building. I could have been a spy and learned a lot. And I did this for a time. We had our 11sies, we stopped for refreshments. They had tea every afternoon on the big veranda, because this was formerly a beautiful townhouse, and they served tea and buns, and the officers mixed with the non-officers. You know, it was very democratic. And they had entertainment at night, movies, they had a dance. we were in this building, and at lunchtime, people had to eat lunch. We didn't have any food or canteen on this huge place. So, at the top of Whitehall, there's the National Gallery, big arts center, very valuable wonderful paintings, etc., etc. And it was in Trafalgar Square, and there was Nelson's statue right up there, all the pigeons, the 4 lions in front. But they had taken out most of the art in case of bomb damage, and then go on to one of the other big galleries and get a concert, piano forte, of classical music played by Myra Hess, a famous pianist at that time in London. She lost it for years. She died eventually. So that was an amazing memory, that here all these people involved in planning the invasion or whatever would rush off, have a quick lunch, and then sit and listen to 15 minutes of beautiful music. They moved our section of landing craft. I still had the Cardex to run. That was the answer to the computer, because we moved the cards around, and the condition of the engines, all these landing craft had to be tuned up at all times, ready to go. And I had to learn something about Scripps engines, the Chrysler engines, and all that stuff, and then where they were. And I had to move these cards around, and there's a list that came out every Friday called the Green List, and it was very important. And I had to go with all these drawers with cards in represented a landing craft and its state. And that was my responsibility. The only thing was, it was Friday and I generally had a date and I had to stay late. And being young and stupid, I didn't see the importance of that. Anyway, there was an atmosphere of tension, but people didn't talk about the war. It's funny, it was business and, oh, we need some more supplies in this room, or we're going to blah, blah, blah. But it was so close to you that you didn't have time to sit back and philosophize in your private moments. When you went home, you the people that did go home, but everybody was living in unfamiliar surroundings, except the civil servants. So they had amusements, things you could do, loved ones. So there was no fighting amongst the women, and all the people working in that place, apart from the officers in charge, were women. I don't recall many men working there. They were all out at the front or seeing active service or flying planes. Ironically, my mother had a little accident at home. She had sprained her ankle. There was no help anymore. We went from having 3 or 4 people working for us to nobody, and Mother couldn't cope. And you could get a chore lady, they were the cleaning ladies, if you're lucky. And Dad was still working, and I applied for compassionate leave. The war was ending, things were calming down a bit, so I got that compassionate leave. In the last few months of the war, I was at home running our house, doing the cooking, getting supplies. An interesting thing happened, because this is very important. Can you imagine, things were in chaos. Well, first of all, the peace was declared, and that was a relief. But war conditions went on. We were still rationed. We took down our black curtains. We relaxed a bit. We didn't have air raids. German occupied all these countries in Western Europe, and there was an appeal made in our church. This applied to the children in Holland. Other churches were doing other parts. But would people in the parish like to take a child that had been through the war, had Germans occupied their house, deprived of food? Would we consider taking them for 3 months? And my father and I were there, and we both had a positive reaction. Mother was still in bed with her ankle. We said, we will do it. And we got this little Dutch girl. She was 9 years old. We met them at a big bus stop in Epsom. We brought her home. She was charming. Her name was Riki, and the last name was Bosley. I took care of her. I was then about 22, or something like that, 23. And I managed, she helped me in the house. We went shopping, and we were in the bus one day coming. We're still German prisoners of war. It took a long time to get them back, and I guess the same applied to English prisoners of war, etc. But they were working on the streets in Epsom, and the bus went by, and she knew they were Germans. And the window was open in the bus, and here's 9 years old, she puts her head out the window and says, "Schweinehund!" And everybody, half the people didn't know what that meant, but she had these feelings at 9 years old. She'd seen enough of the Germans, you know. Well, we were all pretty exhausted. Patsy was home, I was home, Mother had recovered. We were still helping run the house, no rations, etc., etc. My father was thinking of retiring. He was in the middle of it, which meant we had to sell the house. And he wasn't in good health, but he didn't let on. He didn't want to worry the family. So we had a big sign up, the house for sale. We did sell the house, didn't get the price we wanted for it, unfortunately, because we didn't get the right real estate people. We chose a London place. We should have chosen a local. Anyway, one thing or another, I can't believe it. We finally sold all the stuff, the contents, the house, packed up. Then our last time in England was at a little hotel in Epsom, the Woodcote Hotel. That was forever in my mind. And we left on June the 11th, in 1948, 20 years after we had arrived, sailed back, headed for Florida. We arrived in New York, stayed at the New Western Hotel near St. Patrick's Cathedral, and then we got on a train to go down to Fort Lauderdale. Very hot weather, no summer clothes to speak of, because the English don't, they don't have the need for summer clothes. We get on a non-air-conditioned train, and we spent the night on that. This was the 5 of us, Mom, Dad, 3 kids. And then we were met by our long-lost relatives, and they were so American, and we were so British. It was funny. And they were full of their war experiences, and they weren't all that interested in hearing ours. We were a little bit taken aback, And they had rented a house already for us in Fort Lauderdale, a very nice villa. So we moved into that house. But then my father went to see a doctor, was diagnosed with cancer, had an operation, and 2 weeks after the operation, he died. So we were left. Mom didn't like Fort Lauderdale. It was too damn hot. Excuse the language. It was too hot for her, and she'd rather be with her family now that Daddy had gone. And Patsy and I had jobs in Fort Lauderdale, which would be another chapter. The jobs we had there, selling automatic defrosters for refrigerators. Oh boy, selling. Then we had picked up another Buick then. Some very nice people we met. We got their Buick, used Buick, and we packed up to drive back home to New Jersey. We had planned to take 4 days to do it, take a leisurely trip. And meanwhile, Mom's relatives in Passaic had got a house rented for us. It was heaven because the weather was getting cooler. We saw trees instead of those phony things down in Florida. I'm being very outspoken, but it was a relief, and it was raining. And it felt like being home. Mother saw her family again. They gave us a warm welcome. They had a house ready for us to move into. And so after spending 2 nights with them, we moved into Rutherford, which is next door to Passaic. And it was it's a nice town, interesting. A little bit like England, lots of trees. And we settled down there, and the financial situation wasn't too good, because there was a big uncertainty about my father's pension. GE showed up very bad, they picked on some detail in the contract that he wasn't entitled to full pension, and we'd got money from the house we'd sold in England, but still, us girls, I mean, Patsy and I had to look around for jobs. We went up to New York, we interviewed. I had wisely taken a short course in typing and shorthand. Not enough, but she had more experience, and her French, she spoke French fluently, so she got a job at the Belgium American Bank in New York. Quite prestigious. She was a receptionist there. Oh, she first of all worked for NYU, but then she got into the bank. That was very nice for Pat. And I was interviewed, and I got into Town and Country Shoes in the Empire State Building on practically the top floor. It was 84. And it took a long time to commute by elevator because you changed route at floor 80 and went up. And I was still pretty young, 24, 20, and it was an all-woman company, and the salesman would come from all over the States and check into the main office. The New York office. The main office was Sedalia, Missouri, and his name was Mr. Lipscomb. I remember that name. And I was the kind of girl Friday for the office. And it was quite exciting. We commuted by bus, Patsy and I, and then I lost it a year, and then I found my typing and shorthand wasn't really up to snuff, and they got a replacement. So I looked around for another job, and I worked for Transfilm on 5th Avenue near St. Patrick's Cathedral, and they were making TV commercials for big companies, giving a story of the company and putting it into a nice commercial and selling it to people who are interested in advertising, you know. So I worked for this guy, Mark Kramer, who was a ladies' man. I was always going out on errands, bringing him stuff from the office. Would you meet me at the Empire State Building? I want so-and-so file. He did a lot of his office work by phone, and he left me a lot of his writing to do. We had to write letters to these companies presenting our firm, and they weren't American style. They were English schoolgirl kind of typewriting, you know, correct, but didn't lack the punch. Worked late that night. The bus was empty. Bus stops. It reached New Jersey. It stopped on Passaic Street, and in gets this unknown man. He was 7 years younger than I, but I looked pretty young then. I saw him, someone get on the bus, and expecting him to sit maybe several seats away. He sits next to me, and my immediate thought was, these Americans are pretty fresh. You know, that was my reaction. I mean, anyway, he didn't say anything until we got to the Maywood bus station. Then we started talking, and then one thing led to another. And we were talking, about my address, my telephone number, etc. He was living then in Glen Rock. His folks had split up temporarily. He had 2 brothers. They lived in an apartment building. He was working for a florist. And then we made a date, or he called me up and we made a date. And then, etc. We got married in 51. And he had this idea. He wanted to start his own business, and it was going to be nothing else but wedding flowers. And we called it the Bridal Flower Studio. We started with nothing. He had no money to talk of. And at that point, neither did I. So we settled into this little stucco bungalow on Forest Avenue in Paramus. And we plunged into weddings, and he got a very clever scheme to get the attention of brides-to-be. He'd follow the engagement announcements in the paper and follow it up with a visit and a beautiful corsage for the bride-to-be and an invitation to our wedding flower show. which we proceeded to put on in this little bungalow. We had to hide all semblance of our personal belongings and shut the bedroom door and the bathroom. And we invited these brides and their mothers, and he made up special flowers showing all the styles, real flowers, and the church arrangements. And I would come in, well, he built a refrigerator as if he had nothing else to do, with the help of some friends and a brother. And I'd go to the refrigerator and bring out the bouquet, and it was passed down, and the brides looked at it and admired it. And there was about 6 different styles of bridesmaids, and 3 or 4 brides. A lot of flowers put into that, but it was a good investment. And then there was illustrations of the church thing. We did receptions as well, and he got a lot of weddings. We got to the point where we sometimes had 6 weddings on a weekend, and that meant a lot of work. You had to get the flowers 4 days before, and we were keeping them in these big vases in the shower to keep them cool. Then he'd buy a block of ice on the way home. Then he got the refrigerator built. I'm putting a little bit cockeyed. And it turned into so big a business, he had to hire people to work for him on weekends, including members of the family, long-lost cousins. And then he made the big mistake of going on Route 4 and into a bigger building and going into flowers full-time. And that was a big mistake, because suddenly so much overhead. He wasn't a businessman, and it didn't do too well. Within a few months, I found we were pregnant. I was pregnant, and I carried on working with him. I could still do a lot of things. With each bouquet, there was tulle tufts. Each one was made individually. There was pieces of tulle made into little puffs with the flowers, and then each flower was wound with something called green tape. And it was so much work went into that. And he was charging, well, maybe not enough, but he raised his prices. The girls would come to appointments, and they were by then we'd moved into the front part of the dwelling, and we had more room where he talked to the brides and their mothers. And meanwhile, the babies kept quiet in the back. And after Terry arrived, 2 years later, we had Christopher. And that became a little, well, I still continued helping him. And then when Jennifer was expected a year later, we started using the grandmas. I think we were leaving these children at grandmother's if it was a big weekend. Sometimes only a couple of weddings, but of course there were more in the summertime, and a lot of winter weddings, etc. So we managed pretty efficiently like that. And I'd pick up the children at the babysitters. After Jennifer, of course, the next in line was Timothy. After 3 years, Timothy, and followed quickly a year later by Peter. And then on to Madeline, and a year and a half, Hillary, and then Matthew. And the family was thriving. They were all, thank God, well, and we were certainly well-fed and healthy. And meanwhile, my husband became bothered with this osteomyelitis. He had it as a boy, and his leg was feeling strained, standing, It took a lot of standing to design these bouquets and put them together, etc., and delivering them. It was very exhausting. And I dropped out. By then, we were putting shows on at Bamberger's in the basement where they had affairs like that. It was getting a big deal. And we were still managing. And then he had to go to a New York hospital for operation. And I think that's when he decided. By then, we had bought a house, may as well be honest, couldn't pay the mortgage, went bankrupt. Moved to Teaneck, and my husband was always good at getting a great rented house very nice areas, but for little money. And we were near the hospital in Teaneck. And that was handy because they had this leg. I had to go up to New York Hospital to land the Hospital of Special Surgery near the East River. And Ed's leg wasn't clearing up. It was complicated. And he decided he'd have to get a different kind of work. Standing was not a good thing. So I remember seeing him on the little patio outside the Teaneck house, looking at the want ads. And he saw this someone opening for a experienced hearing aid salesman. So he didn't let the word experience stop him. He proceeded to, he went down to see what was involved, and he saw he could take several tests and exams, go to get a college, I don't know, it was a degree, but at least a license to do this. He worked for a nice guy, Mr. Schubert, in Hackensack. And he was doing very well as a salesman. He was a very good salesman. People always liked him. And he had a way of getting his message across. So life achieved some kind of rhythm. And the children were going to school then. And we were having family affairs that always seemed to be every time of the year, every weekend, a birthday party, or someone was getting confirmed, or, getting baptized, etc. And we made friends in Teaneck. We decided to move, definitely. We didn't want, Teaneck was a bit built up. And we looked around, and we saw Hillsdale looked like a nice town. It had character, history. And we went up there, we heard about this house. It was just right for us. It was an old-fashioned house, but it had a nice lawn, nice backyard, and a nice quiet street. And it was Westdale Drive. And a lot of children, the total amount of children, they used the block as a playground. There were so many kids. So we settled down there, and they found schools. They all had to start new schools, which was hard for them. But they got older, and they had projects. They painted the house together under their father's guidance. And when the autumn came and all the trees, we had lots of trees, the leaves descended. The boys were out there with the rakes, and they carted all the leaves into the street. When we went to the Long Beach Island every year for a week, we'd find a cottage to rent, and that was the high point of the good times, because they all pitched in. They all packed the clothes they needed, not much shorts, swim trunks, a few shirts. And I did the major packing, and my husband and I always went down in February to look over what was for rent, and while the pickings were good. And then we were told by the children, call back and tell us as soon as you got something, and how many steps is it from the ocean? I have 8 children and 13 grandchildren, and now in April there will be 7 great-grands. Well, I just love them all so much, and I'm proud of them all. I've been very fortunate. Wonderful family. Family is very important. I used to hear people say that, but it is. Well, I think having a good, supportive family, no family is perfect, but it counts for a lot in the end, and it teaches you a lot about life. It keeps things moving along. And when you're really down, to have a family to support you in some way. I don't mean financially, but every way, emotionally. I always tried my hand at writing in school. I was good at it, short stories and writing. But someone told me, one of my neighbors said they'd been going to classes at local colleges and universities, that were welcoming seniors, and it wasn't any, I think it was a very nominal cost. I don't remember exactly. So I went to Berkeley Community College, and I liked it, and his name was Ronald D. Cristoforo, and he was very supportive. And he said, Kathleen, you've got talent. You should go on writing. And that gave me an enormous boost. Nobody had ever really told me that. At school, maybe. And then I took a course there, and then I also went to Fairleigh Dickinson College, and another good experience. And then Ramapo College up in, north of Ramsey, Marwa. And then I really enjoyed it. It was fun. I'd go at night, but it wasn't too far to travel. And that gave me a real, I could see I could do poetry. I enjoyed writing poetry, all kinds of poetry. And then I started looking, that course finished, and I started looking in the brochures that were being sent out for senior classes for people interested in different subjects. And I always looked for the poetry or the literature, and I joined a group. This woman, she was a published poet, and she had a group of men, women, all ages, as old as, well, I was only then about in my late 70s. I joined that class. And we met every week, and we had a subject to write on. I liked having that challenge. And we'd read them the next week to each other, and we were told to be free to criticize, always say something nice, but criticize other people's, and she would give a critique. And I learned a lot by that. I learned a lot from going to these college courses. And then we got into this little group in Marwa, and we got to know each other. And then I got used to, you have to learn what's a good poem and what isn't. And we had an excellent teacher. She would tell you downright, no, rewrite that, it's awful. Or it's too sentimental, or you haven't got enough, the words don't fall in rhythm. And then we read good poetry in the class. And I always liked poetry. And I got some of the kids were enjoying their poetry classes. And so I started writing a few, and then I started submitting the poems in. I remember the first one was in a paper down on Long Beach Island about the two sides of the island, the bay and the ocean, and contrasting them and how you felt. And then they published them, of course, not too particular, but then I got a little more ambitious, and I send my poems to better known publications with good reputations. If I persisted, it's very disheartening if you get a few returned with a nice note. You still have to send them in. And altogether, I'm not being modest when I say that. If I'd tried harder, I'd have got many more published, but I got at least a dozen published. I couldn't send it to publishers. The competition, I don't think I'd get anywhere with that. So I looked on publishers, and I saw PIP publishers, or printers in Paramus. I thought, well, I'll go along there. I was still pretty naive. I was old enough to be much more knowledgeable. This youngish girl encouraged me, and she pretended to read the poems, but I had to put the order in which I wanted them to be, and eventually they were published. I ordered, I think it was 100 copies. I visualized handing them around to all the families, and that included different cousins and whatnot, and I did that. And the family, I don't think were old enough to really appreciate. Then now I read a poem and, hey, that's good, Mom, they're old enough. And I try to leave that legacy for my children. The art school was in Epsom, the Epsom School of Art. It was an old building, before the Victorians, I guess. We had life lessons drawing from real life, and we had nudes, drawing nudes. And I loved drawing people. That was my forte. The boys would never sit still, but I did manage to get the girls, namely, mostly Hillary and Madeline. And some were saved in the numerous moves, you know, the downsizing, and I'm glad I have them. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't get it. We were taught, we had all the sacraments as children being brought up as Catholics, and I didn't really have much experience in it. I just got bored during Mass and all that. But I love the stories of the Bible and the parables and the stories of the Old Testament and everything that find my imagination. But as I get older and the troubles, your life experience unfolds and life becomes a little more harder to cope with. And then you see the need of belief, of faith, and prayer. And my sister was very religious, and she did a lot in forming my spiritual formation. And thank God, I've lived long enough to get to see that maybe the Lord left me to live long enough to do more good and straighten out a few things of my own character and temperament. Well, if they're fortunate enough to have some religious training from no matter what belief that is, try and stick to that. It'll be something you cling to later. And then try and make God part of your life. Have conversations with God. Talk to, you know, whatever it is, the Lord, God, Jesus, and the Holy Mother. These things come essential like life rafts thrown out to you in time of trouble. And the prayers are heard. Prayers are heard. There is a hereafter. Remember that, don't forget it. And it helps you have a better life to, follow the golden rule, to love God and your neighbor as yourself. And you can't go too wrong. And don't expose yourselves to things are going to cause sin or not ugly, dark things. Keep your mind at a high standard and good level, and develop a strong personality, or a strong character, I should say. Personality's not the answer. But, and don't give up hope. Hang on to hope. There's some wonderful things that happen. There are some heroes around. There are inspirational people that suddenly, out of the blue, do the most wonderful, heroic things, generous things. And as long as there are people like that, with simple people, they don't have to be intellectuals, but the intellect, every kind of person has to be part of the human family. And we know how to. It's good if you can sort the chaff from the wheat, or the phonies from the real people.